Hello, I'm Annette Young and welcome to the 51%, a show about women reshaping our world. Coming up, public outrage over the brutal murder of a young Mexican woman that's highlighted the extent of femicide in Mexico. Also, latest figures revealing that in terms of economic participation, the gender gap will take 257 years to close. We'll be talking to economist Anne Boring on what steps governments and companies need to urgently take in order to speed up the process. Also, how the sport of fencing is being used to heal victims of sexual assault here in France. But we begin in Mexico, where the gruesome murder of a 25-year-old woman in the Mexican capital has sparked outrage across the nation. This after leaked photos of her mutilated body appeared on a newspaper's front page. Femicide is a massive problem in the Central American country. An average of 10 women are estimated to be killed each day in Mexico, with more than 40% of them being murdered by their partners.
This is how 25-year-old Ingrid Escamilla is being remembered on social media. A cascade of serene images that couldn't be further from the circumstances of her death. Killed, then dismembered, gutted and skinned by her partner, pictures of Escamilla's mutilated body were then splashed across the front page of Mexico's tabloids. Her case is just one out of the 10 femicides committed in Mexico every day. Of the 10 victims, at least 4 are killed by their partners. Official data showed that 3,142 women nationwide were murdered in 2018, the highest figure in 30 years. Meanwhile, Mexico's president accused the press of weaponizing the subject.
The issue of femicide has been manipulated by certain media outlets critical of this administration. They're using every incident as a pretext to wage a defamation campaign against this government.
His remarks came just a day before Escamilla's murder. Protests have intensified in Mexico in recent months, with women taking to the streets to demand that the government do more to protect them. They say the vast majority of killers escape justice.
In the last 4 years, femicides in Mexico have doubled. And because the authorities are indifferent, lazy, men think they can keep killing women. So we feminists are going to keep going until they learn to respect us and until they learn that they have to let us live.
Escamilla's death comes just 3 weeks after the killing of feminist activist Isabela Cabanillas de la Torre. The 26-year-old was shot in the head in Ciudad Juarez, nicknamed the capital of murdered women.
Okay, here's some uplifting news for everybody. None of us will see gender parity in our lifetimes, or nor likely will many of our children. That's the sobering finding by the World Economic Forum, which reveals that gender parity in all areas, such as politics and education, won't be attained for 99.5 years. So let's go through some of their other findings. In terms of economic participation, the gender gap will take 257 years to close. Across the world, only 55% of women aged 15 to 64 are currently engaged in the labour market, as opposed to 78% of men. And there are still 72 countries where women are barred from opening bank accounts or obtaining credit. Joining me now is Anne Boring, an economist and also a professor at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Anne, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
When you hear those statistics, it must be incredibly hard not to put your head into your hands, because here we are, we're in the 21st century, but we're still so far way behind. What is holding us back?
So there are quite a lot of things that are holding us back. I think for a long period of time, we kind of thought that naturally economies would tend towards gender equality. And what we're finding is that that is not the case. So women still have difficulties accessing economic power, globally speaking. There are quite some differences, of course, between more or less advanced economies. But even in the more advanced economies, we still see that women are not holding these the places of economic power as much as men. And they're still very much far behind.
And I want to talk about those developed nations, because you look at places such as France or Germany or UK or America, and you would assume that we would be advancing. But what specifically is holding us back in those countries?
So there are several elements holding us back. One of them, of course, has to do with maternity and everything that's related to parenthood, where women bear the larger share of parenting duties. There's also the choices of fields of study and the development in human capital. That there are still very large differences between men and women on that area. If you look at people who actually access positions of power, a lot of them have gone to, for instance, in France, to grandes écoles or to engineering schools, and
effectively very prestigious tertiary institutions.
Very prestigious, very competitive, and we see through more and more studies conducted in economics that women tend to not perform as well, not because they're not as good as men, quite to the contrary, but it's just that the environment is not necessarily helpful for women to actually move up the ranks.
Now, if you look at the business community, we are still a very small percentage in senior management. And even just recently here in France, Isabelle Cocher, the head of an energy company in France, the only female CEO in the French CAC 40, lost her job. Now, Le Monde newspaper reporting that she was seen to be headstrong. Now, that's a quality that one would assume, being a CEO, you would want to have somebody very determined and strong, but apparently that was an issue. So it shows just how hard it is for women at very senior levels, even if they manage to get to those positions, doesn't it?
Yeah, so stereotypes still are a barrier to women's advancement, and the stereotype of the male or the economic leader is still male. So it's harder for women to be seen as being competent in when they reach positions of economic power. They're also held to male stereotypical standards, and therefore they can be sanctioned because they're not behaving in ways that are expected that they should behave because they are women. So these stereotypes still hold. And we see that women are penalized much more for any type of fault or any type of potential wrongdoing than men can be in these types of economic power.
Is there any sector of business where things are indeed starting to change?
So what's quite interesting is that it does not depend on the percentage of women in a given field. So once we reach positions of economic power, any area of the economy, any sector has pretty much the same patterns going on. So it's really more something about gaining economic power. There are some policies that can be implemented, however, to help competent women reach these leadership positions. But there's still a lot of work to be done. I think a lot of governments are trying to figure out what types of policies to implement now.
And that's what I want to talk to you about, because female economic empowerment is a very sort of trendy term at the moment, and there are governments, including the French government, looking at ways to improve women's access to economic power. In your opinion, what needs to be done?
So since the 1990s, approximately, there's this business case for gender equality, which suggests that businesses can actually perform better if there is more diversity in leadership positions. Types of policies that can be implemented are policies in which firms have very strong incentives to actually implement this gender equality. For instance, we've seen that quotas on boards of administrations actually really help women get into leadership positions. You can also rearrange parental leave and parental care, and here also create incentives such that household duties are more equally shared between men and between women. That would also reduce the cost for firms of hiring women instead of men if they expect that men and women are going to be as likely to be out of the office for a given period of time.
And I have to say, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you.
Now, here in France, some victims of sexual assault are using a rather unusual type of therapy to help them on the road to recovery. It's fencing, the unique program being created by a doctor and a former Olympic fencing champion. Emerald Maxwell has the story.
They've chosen to confront their demons, armed with a sword. These 6 women are survivors of sexual assault. Fencing is their therapy, their armour, helping them to face life's twists and turns.
With the mask, the gloves, the saber, it feels like nothing else can happen to you. You just feel incredibly strong and powerful. It starts like a typical therapy session, but quickly the psyche makes way for the physical and 3 hours of sport. Attack, defense, self-protection, touching. The vocabulary of fencing evokes suppressed feelings. A therapist and physio are on hand to help the women process them.
In fencing, there's firstly the uniform that provides protection. Then, of course, there's the weapon. There's also a mask, which means people can project their attacker's face onto their opponent. It can help to bring out feelings that might have been suppressed when they were younger, because they weren't able to express them at the time.
Today's theme of limits is one that resonates.
I was abused as a child. At the age of 6 or 7, you're building a framework for life, defined by your consciousness. And when limits are crossed early on, you can quickly lose any sense of boundaries.
In fencing, the piste is the limit. Behind the elastic is the safe area.
Cette place-là, où tu es à la fois dedans, dehors, là, où tu n'es pas encore à l'extérieur de la piste, donc tu es à la limite.
The sport is a metaphor which helps the women to get back on track, finding the right distance, knowing how to say stop.
Stop.
The masks come off towards the end of the session for some face-to-face therapy.
On n'en sort pas transformé.
We don't leave the class transformed, but we have healed some wounds. We leave better equipped to advance in life, but it's not a magic wand.
C'est pas un coup de baguette magique.
The therapy program is now in its 8th year. For 110 euros a session, women and men are using fencing to fight trauma.
And that's it for now. You can also connect with us via our Facebook page, that of course being France24.51%, or do send us a tweet at _51%. So until our next show, bye for now.